All right. Let's go ahead and get started with the discussion this morning. I've chosen a verse for us to look at, a couple verses. So if you want to look at 1 John chapter 4,
I'm going to come separate you two.
1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 is kind of where I want us to reflect on so I want us to think about, because we've been talking for a few weeks about how we think about God and kind of the dominant way that people have talked about God for most of Christian history is they've postulated God in terms of God's beingness, what is God as a being, what are his attributes, but it's somewhat abstract. It's somewhat theoretical. And it's a continuation of how the Greeks had been talking about what is the essence of God. Plato had been talking about the same sort of things. But if there's a change that might be beneficial, which is not to say everything that's been said has been wrong, no. But could there be a change which would then not discarding everything that's been said, but also to add something to how we think about God? I think it's this idea of thinking about God in terms of relationship primarily. So instead of God as being, and who is God in his being, what are his attributes? Does he have this? Does he have that? How does he exist in his own realm? And then instead of those kinds of questions, we think about God in terms of the immediacy of how we relate to God. And a verse that talks about it in this way is what John is saying in 1 John 4. Because if we look at what John's saying, it's very immediate. It's intimate. It's personal. So if you remember when we were kind of tracing the progress of ideas about God through Judaism, and I suggested that with Jesus, the understanding of God becomes God is personal and God is human. Shocking. Nobody was expecting God to show up as a human being and for that to be how God manifests God's self. So if we really go back to thinking again about is Jesus presenting God to us in this kind of personal way, what does that mean? And maybe that's what John's talking about. So here we are in John 4. I want to look at verses 7 and 8. John says, "Beloved, let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." Now, if we think about what John's saying, right, how do we know God? We've been kind of talking about how in the history of people's, even Christian thinking about God, we say, well, let me explain to you God. He's omnipresent, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent. We start talking like this. And John says, how you know God is through your own participation in love. Because that is what the substance of God is. If you say, what is the essence of God? What is the very fundamental nature of God? Well, God is love. And therefore, if you want to know God, you must love. That's a very different way of approaching how do we understand God? How do we know God? It's not describing God in terms of these kind of lofty attributes, somewhat abstract, somewhat theoretical. It's saying, no, you start with your own actions. Your attempts to actually love someone else is how you will come to know God. So, what are some of the implications of thinking about it this way?
One is, the way we used to think about God, we may find that it is the opposite of how we understood him. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, every one of us, all of us, have a misunderstanding of God and how he understands relationships with everybody.
Okay.
I just think we grow in that knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. If the foundation is actually in the midst of our own attempts to love, then you cannot know God, is what he's saying. You cannot know God apart from you actually loving. So if you go on YouTube and you look for videos about the proofs for the existence of God, and we're going to prove to you God exists because there was a creation, there must be a creator. No one can come to know God that way. I don't even think you can come to know about God very well that way, right? You can get some ideas in your head, but how accurate are those if God is love? Then if there's these, presentations of trying to explain to you the nature of God and his attributes, both moral and kind of in terms of power and existence, where does that leave you?
It leaves you giving him human attributes.
Well, yeah, that's true. We have to think in terms of things, that we're familiar with. So we extrapolate from human
Like
attributes.
superhuman attributes or whatever.
My love can be flawed. Just with my upbringing.
Sure.
I know. I mean, Joe asked me the other day, saying how much you love me. I said, well,
If you know anything about German synthesis, oversimplified humans who have conflict with each other really oversplit narrative that'll really set us down in narratives. We'll see things like other churches.
what's that?
I had to mute. Someone else had something else going on. I got it. I had to find.
Relation to this.
I agree with that.
Something about German, I don't know.
Hang on.
Wasn't a comment
That
about.
was what you were gonna say.
Oh,
wasn't it?
yeah, it was.
I got to make sure I did. I think I muted myself in the process, which is then I'll be getting text messages saying I can't hear anything. I think we're okay. Technology, you got to love it.
Today is a great day.
It has to be great technology today.
Well, Zoom, as convenient as it can be, is not my most favorite application. Okay, so yes.
Yeah, and I told Joe, I said, I love you much greater now. I don't know, and there's more God in my love for him now, because when I married him, it was much more of a possessive love.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. I like where you're taking us. So, we take John very seriously. The only way to know God is through love, and like you said, but our experience of love is going to be imperfect, and it hopefully is going to change and grow and become deeper, more selfless. Because, well, and I shouldn't always say that, because sometimes selfless love, or what appears to be selfless love, is not really selfless love. It's a kind of like I pour out myself, but I'm expecting something back. So you're right. Here's a paradox, an irony. You can only know God through love, and yet your attempts to love are going to be imperfect. So the only way I can start knowing God is imperfectly through my attempts to love others, which will never be all that they should be in terms of reflecting the love of God. So that it suggests this has to be something that progresses over time, that changes. I come to know God more and more, the more and more I learn to love. So we're coming to know God through our experiences, not as a subject to be discussed. Let's talk about God, let's diagram him out. He's not a subject to be discussed or an object to be examined. He is an experience to be had. That's where he shows up, in our experiences. Okay?
Yeah, along with what Carolyn says, I mean,
does have to be perfect, in order for it to be love. But where Paul was talking, the scripture he read today, where it talks about these big grandiose things, but then love is being patient, it's being kind, it's not being rude, it's not this thing that you really have to perfect, you just have to try, in a sense, and that, and if we, what you're saying, if we don't think of God as this being that we get to know, but this essence that we need to understand, that every time we're patient, we're actually ushering in God.
Yes.
Every time we're not, we choose to not be rude, that's bringing God to life, or incarnationally,
Yeah.
the way we're choosing to love.
Yeah, exactly.
Just these small acts.
And each one, as imperfect as it is, still is going in that direction. So, yeah, I don't have to be perfectly kind, but if I can be just a little more kind, I have come to know God in the midst of kindness. If you can take 1 Corinthians 13 and take out love and put in God, because God is love, right? God is kind, God is patient, God keeps no record of wrongs. I mean, everything he's saying about love he's saying about God. But I like your point is, yeah, I don't have to imagine I've got to do this perfectly. I just need to do it at least a little bit at all. Any degree to which I do this, I am starting to come to know God. And again, it's not because someone's explained to me a bunch of facts and presented to me this, superior being, the supreme being, and how he no, it's in, was I kind to somebody in my everyday life? God comes to me in the midst of my own actions. So there's a great quote by Paula Darcy. I think she's the one who said it first. I've heard a lot of people say it since, is that God comes to you disguised as your own life. Think about that. God comes to you disguised as your own life. Where is God? Look at your own life. He's in the midst of it. Every challenge, every opportunity to love was God coming to you, right? God coming to you and making his appeal to you to know him through that.
And where you are.
Yeah, exactly. And where you are. He shows up right where you are in the midst of your life. And I saw this quote last week from Catherine of Genoa, I think, she said, God is the deepest part of me. I love that. Now, what also goes along with that you could add is, but I don't know the deepest part of me. That's my problem, right? The me I tend to know is very shallow. But her affirmation was, deep, deep, deep within me, God is present. What's she affirming? We are creating the image of God. There is the very image and presence of God deep within us, but we have to find how to get in touch with it. We have to come alive to the God who is present, who has always been present. So we want to talk, God is omnipresent. Let's make that practical. He is the deepest part of you. That's personal, experiential presence of God. Instead of talking about theoretically God's omnipresence, talk about it personally. So basically, kind of what I see is happening in Christian thinking over the last century or so is this emphasis on the existential. That within our lived experience, within our own existence, is where we meet God. We've tended for so long to talk about God as a subject to be discussed and all these facts about who this supreme being is, but it's kind of come up at the end not being all that helpful. Not that it's all of those things aren't necessarily true. I'm not saying, they're all false, but it's not helpful. What is more helpful is what John's doing, is telling you where you find God is in your own life and in your own attempts to love. That's where we start finding, okay, that's how I can know God. Can't be explained to me. He can't be proven to me. I discover him as I move forward in love. Now, what does that suggest about how we think then about faith? if you can't know God until you love, what do you have to do to know God?
Trust.
You got to take a risk. Yeah, you've got to trust in a way that takes a risk. I have to risk at loving. And that's a risk, right? And unless it's somebody who's really safe and you know they're going to love you in return and there's no risk there, but most of the time, there's a risk involved. So if I'm saying, okay, God is love and he can't be known until I love, then I can't know God until I risk participation in what I'm being told is the very essence of God. And knowledge of God always comes after the experiences.
You know, Greg, this may be off totally, but, you know, I tend to be very hard on myself. You know, so people always say you have to forgive yourself. The experience of really being able to comprehend that has been as I've grown and learned to love people that have hurt me or that I don't agree with. And as I learn to do that, then I'm more able to understand how God can forgive me, because I can't do it mentally.
Right.
I can only do it as I experience the ability to do that, to
Yes.
look beyond who they are or what they've done. Then it's easier for me to say, okay, I can begin to understand how God can do that.
Yes.
If that makes any sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And I like what you're saying your experience is knowledge comes from experience. It does not come because someone tells you a bunch of stuff. That's hearsay. Right? You can tell me all about God and you can tell me all of his attributes and you can give me the proofs for the existence, but it's all hearsay. And it's not that convincing. Because even if, well, maybe not. I don't feel compelled to believe it. But what we really know is what we've experienced. That's what existential theology and philosophy has been talking about for the last 150 years. It finally tapped into the understanding that all this speculation, theoretical and abstract, has not really brought us any closer. And really, we need to. I think about it this way: instead of working from the top down, like what are the magnificent superlative attributes of God, and then we'll work down to my life. What if we flip it and we work from the bottom up? And why don't I just start with what is my experience, and then find out through my experience who God is showing himself to be. If these things like God comes to you disguised as your life, you know, you don't need a book of archaic, kind of abstract, theoretical statements about God. You need to look what is happening in your life. Where is God showing up? And if God is the essence of our relationship, if he is what is flowing between us in our relationship, then that's where you have to look for him and discover him.
Just another point too, as we're talking, I was thinking, you really can't do that without community. I mean,
Right.
You said before it's hard to be a Christian on an island.
I didn't say it was hard to be a Christian on a desert island. I said it's impossible.
So it's not only practicing it with each other, but I mean, it's also practicing it with our enemy. It's also actually getting together to, I guess, work through the complications of this as we actually move forward.
Yeah. The reason I said that statement, I know people have had trouble with it, and that's okay, but I'm trying to see, if being a Christian is having ideas in my head, then alone on a desert island I can be a Christian. Because I can believe in the Trinity, and I can believe in the Incarnation, I can believe in the Bible, but I'm all alone, and I'm a Christian. Because being a Christian is all about having the right ideas in my head. But what I've been saying for years is, you can't be a Christian on a desert island all alone. Because being a Christian is loving your neighbor, and you ain't got any. So it is impossible. See, if being a Christian is action, then if I can't do anything, I'm not a Christian. I love this other statement. I've forgotten who to attribute them to anymore, but it's, we only believe as much as we do. We only believe as much as we do. So if I want to measure what I really believe, look at what I'm doing. But I can ask that about God. How much do I believe in God? How do I believe in God? Look at what I'm doing. That reveals to myself who I believe God to be. Because God is in my actions. And whatever I'm doing that's the God I believe in. Now, if that bothers me, then I need to go, maybe I need to do things differently because I only believe and my God is described by what I'm doing. Now, and we're all going to be imperfect, right? So back to David. So I'm imperfectly loving, but that shows the God I'm aspiring to. I'm aspiring to a God who loves, and that's why I go very conscious of how imperfectly I do it. I'm trying to do that. That's where I'm finding. Yeah, Alan?
Well, I love that comment, but also want to add on to the previous comments too, and since we're a group of, I double checked before I said this, since we're all middle-aged in here or older.
The teens are in another room.
Yeah, but I'm even talking about the 30, 40 something. So I love the comment about experience and forgiving people because you become more experienced, that you have that experience with love. And you know, you have to be careful when you say, and one of the things I did say to Amy one time in a conversation and had to be very careful about it was, you know, once you experience having children, for people that didn't have children, or certainly for those that adopted, understand, you know, because that's the ultimate love in adopting a child, fostering a child. But to understand God's love for me is the same. I see a lot in that experience of growing up with that snotty teenager that, you know, you still love, but they're a snotty teenager. And then they go to college and they're more, you know, they're smarter than you, and then they're in their 30s and they start to think, well, maybe you're not as dumb as I thought you were, although still maybe dumb. But experience, you know, I can't tell you how much my experiences over the last 6 or 7 years have profoundly changed my ability to love. And I don't demonstrate it sometimes as well as I should with Candy, and I certainly, you know, sometimes I'm frustrated with my kids. But ultimately, my compassion and understanding towards others who I don't agree with politically, like I said earlier, that I don't agree with their principles, that I don't agree with the way that they raise their parents, that's not how God looks at them. He loves them, and
Yeah.
I don't think I can say something like that.
Yeah. Now, you're saying what? We get to know God more and more over the length of our lives. I believe that can be the case. Now, it's not necessarily the case, but it can be the case. Hopefully, we're making it the case, right? That God shows up in the events of our lives. So some of the things I've talked about in the last few weeks, and then I'm sure have been puzzling. So John Caputo talks about God as events. Well, I don't know everything that I can't even understand everything John Caputo talks about or writes. So, but what he seems to be saying that attracts my attention is it's this idea that the real existence of God is in the things that happen, right? So in one sense, I could say, if I don't love, there is no God. But if I love, there is a God. In some ways, I am making, now, because I'm not talking about objectively, is there a God? I'm talking about subjectively. For me, if I love, then I am affirming there is a God. And that God is actually taking shape in what I'm trying to do. And when I choose not to, I have just, in that instance, been an atheist, right? But I'm saying from, again, working from the bottom up, not from the top down, who is God and then how do I fit under, no, working from the bottom up. Who who is God? God is love. I know him by love, by my actions. So he shows up in those events. And then I start realizing I, day by day, can decide whether there will be a God today for me. Right? Does that make sense? I'm not talking about whether there is a God out there, again, from the other perspective. I'm talking about, for me personally, I get to make the choice. Is there a God? There may be a God. Who's it up to? Me. Whether I actually make him incarnate and decide there's a God, all my affirmations are useless apart from my actions, right? We're back to, it doesn't matter what's in my head. It matters how I'm living. So if God is showing up in the events of our lives, if God comes to us disguised as our life, if these kinds of ideas are actually helpful, they're pushing us to the practical, to the not theoretical, but engaged. Have to be engaged. And so in some sense, I either make God or don't make God.
Greg, recently had an experience with someone I know that claimed to be atheist. And thought that I would probably try to convince her of the existence of God.
Yeah.
But instead, I just am showing loving kindness instead, and don't care what she really says about that belief.
Yeah, because the thing is, everyone I've known who's professed to be agnostic or actually to actively believe there is no God, they're still loving people.
Yeah.
And so they're caught up in how we talked about a theoretical supreme being was where they have their problems, not in the practicality. If we were to talk about that the reality of God is the love that flows between us, but we're trying to convince them there's a supreme being sitting on a throne who's intervening and say, but he didn't say my son from cancer who died at 10 years old, and so I'm an atheist. See, but they're quote unquote an atheist because they love so much. That's the irony, right? They love their son so much that they lost, so they're so much into God, but they're not into this concept of a God. Does that make sense? So
Some of the situations that came from the sins of organized religion.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So if we bring it down to this experiential level, and if we kind of learn to avoid what we were taught to do, is try and convince people of a concept, of ideas, and just try and be more the people who just live out the realities and affirm to others God is in the lived realities. I'm not going to try and tell them, well, you believe in God, you don't realize it, because that's usually offensive. But I can see the God I believe in, they believe in too.
It sort of sounds like.
Right? They really do, because they live that way. They long for love and to show love. So absolutely they're believing in the God I believe in.
You're saying the things that I had to choke back and refrain from saying to Christian when he shared his,
Yeah.
testimony.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it almost sounds like you're saying that maybe we should live a little bit like Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. When did he ever try and convince someone of an abstract idea about his father and what his father could do or couldn't do, or his father's ethereal? He never said anything like that. It was all very immediate. This is my father, and it's in the, in our relationship. I call him Abba. I'm close to him. Never trying to prove anything. Right? And y'all are familiar with where he says you've got to live it, right? Gospel of John, chapter 5. I can never remember. There's so many verses I pull out of here that I keep forgetting if it's 5 or 7. So hang on a second.
19 and 5.
Maybe that's it. Yeah. It might be earlier. I was thinking, no. But all these places, yeah, they're very similar. I'm thinking of the place where he says, if you want to know whether the things I do, the authority by which I do things, then you, if you do them, then you will know, right?
John 8,
5:36.
ultimate teaching.
Is it
It's John 7:17.
7:17? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I've got it highlighted in green. Okay. Just wasn't scanning through it. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you, John David. Yeah. If anyone is willing to do his will, meaning the will of the Father.
Thank you, God.
Yeah.
God's voice from
Yeah.
Zoom.
The disembodied. Yeah. Yeah. So, he's being questioned. How do we know that what you're saying is true? Where's your authority? You're saying these outlandish things. How do we know? Jesus' response, 7:17. If anyone is willing to do his will, the Father's will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak for myself. You won't know it until you do it. That's what he's saying. They're asking for, explain it to us and give us proof. And he's basically saying, I can't. You're going to have to do it, and then you will know. Yeah, you're going to have to act in faith. Where faith is not certainty, but it's risk. Sometimes we've gotten the wrong idea that faith is being certain about things. Faith is not being certain about really anything. It's risking about everything in a direction that you deem to be worthwhile.
Well, and as Jenny said, experience it.
Yeah,
It's
and
experience.
right. So we don't get the information and then act on it. We actually have to act on something and then reflect on it. That's the real pattern of life, is we act on something that we hope and think will be helpful or good, and then you have to assess. Was it? Did I learn anything? And that's when we know. We might know, not going to do that again, or we might know that's in the right direction. And Jesus is affirming the same thing to people who want to know without doing. He says, you can't, it doesn't work that way. I'm the Son of God, and I can't even explain it to you. You've got to engage. So if Jesus is saying the truth is existential, it's in lived experience. And apart from that, it's all hearsay. It's alleged. And you can hear it, but until you do it, you'll never know whether it was real or not.
Yeah, some of this is also from the fact that words are an imperfect representation of
Yeah.
So at best, it's imperfect. So you can't really fully explain something with words.
Yeah, and you can't explain what you know by experience always in words. I mean, everyone did it very well today about Honduras, but if you've never been to Honduras, it's like, wow, that sounds interesting. Yeah, but go there and then you'll know what they're talking about, right?
Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
But when we went last year, we were like, no words can describe it,
Yeah.
or pictures don't do justice.
Yeah,
You
you-
have to experience the Grand Canyon.
That's exactly what we would say about spiritual matters. You can hear someone else's testimony. You've got to risk attempting it for yourself. Someone else could say, look, I didn't ever think I could do this, but I learned to forgive someone who was cruel to me, and I found peace. I mean, it all sounds good. I'll never know if it's true until I attempt to go down the path of forgiving someone who was cruel to me, and then find out, were they right? And I'm risking, right? It's risk. You don't know.
That the faith where Jesus is, when he says, those who have forgiven much, is that
Yeah.
they have to have faith that they it's not about following the rules, but it's about, I've been forgiven, so I'm free
Yeah, people don't
free to
do
love. It's not about the
Yeah.
following the law, it's about.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example, because that's when he's in the house of the Pharisee, and the Pharisee, I think it's Simon the Pharisee, maybe it's not the guy's name. Anyway, he's critical of the woman who's come in crying and washing Jesus' feet, and Jesus says she's been forgiven much, and so she loves much. But of course, he says, you didn't wash my feet. I mean, he showed little love, but then he didn't have a sense that he'd been forgiven much, right? So that's a perfect example of experience. She had experienced something the Pharisee had not. He could, but he hadn't. He hadn't experienced radical forgiveness because he hadn't experienced his own sinfulness. And so it was hampering him. Jesus can't explain to him what the woman knows. He would have to experience deep forgiveness, and it would make him a loving person, right?
Following the law takes the risk out of it.
Yes, it does. Yeah, and it's so antithetical to being a person of love. Yeah, following the law will never make you loving. Even if you follow the instruction to be loving, then you're doing it in a kind of a mechanical, obedient way, and that's not real love either. I mean, it's better than nothing, and to be told and go do this because it's loving is kind of a helpful step, but at some point your heart's got to get into it, and you've got to get taken up by it and swept away by it. And then you don't need the law anymore, right? It's all fulfilled in love God and love your neighbor, but it's not because you've got two instructions anymore. It's because now you realize it was training wheels on a bicycle trying to get you to learn to ride. And once you learn to ride, you just take off the training wheels. I don't even need the command to love God. I don't need that command. I don't need it as a command. It's already a desire, right? So it's not like I'm down to obeying two commands. No, I'm not obeying them anymore. They're actually descriptive of the way I now experience reality. It's the love of God and love of neighbor. That's the essence of everything. Great example. Alan, you had another thought?
I mean, I know we're up on time,
Yep.
but that's just, then how do you explain, or would you explain, I should say, would you explain, the people that refuse the experiences? And what I'm thinking, and certainly Jesus had knowledge of this and talking about it, but manna showed up every night.
Yeah.
They experienced it. They experienced that they weren't going to go hungry and starve because manna showed up every night, and they saw the Red Sea part and all that. So what makes it about humans that when they do have those experiences, they refuse to believe?
I would suggest that those examples are excellent, and the way to personally apply them is to ask, what manna is showing up every night and I don't see it? Because it's not like I see it and I refuse to see it. My problem,
Are you married?
my problem is, and think about how it's described in Scripture, the problem is blindness, darkness. Why are those descriptive of our condition? It's not because I see it and go, I don't want to see it. It's because I'm blind. I'm in the dark. I'm actually not seeing the God who is showing up in everything all the time. And it's not that I'm insincere when I say, I don't see God. I'm sincere. The problem is I don't have eyes to see. My eyes have not been open. The scales have not fallen off them, right? So we're all in that condition. And the question for me is not why haven't others seen it? The only existential question is, it doesn't matter whether Don is seeing this or Ken seeing it. It only matters what is Greg not seeing or seeing, right? In that existential thing, it's about my experience. And so, yes, I need to ask, am I like the Israelites? Eating manna every day and wondering, where's the God who brought us out of Egypt?
It's interesting you brought that up because my experience, I don't know if y'all remember that I went through like 6 months where I was homeless in the sense that I had sold my house and the one I was gonna buy fell through and I didn't have a house. And I went through 6 months, not having a house. So I had to live with friends and my kids, and I was so focused on, why isn't God giving me a house? And my brother was dying, and he had texted me because he's known my life, and like, how do you keep doing what you're doing? And the thing of the Israelites hit me, and that's what I said. I felt like the Israelites. I was having manna all the time. I had friends who gave me homes. I had family who gave me homes. But I was so focused on what I thought God should be doing, I was blind to the manna that came in my life every day and making myself miserable day after day. So, that was very personal to me, that kind of experience.
Right.
And I was like the Israelites, complaining and grumbling and ignoring all the good
That's something
things
showing up. Yeah.
that were happening in my life.
Perfect application of
Hey, Greg.
an existential belief in God, right?
Next week, can you take, so on Jeannie's side, talking about our blindness, can there be forces, dark forces?
Oh yeah, there's verses. Yes, there are verses. Yeah. Taking captive by the devil to do his will, right? We have to be set free, and thank God there's someone who has set us free, whose kingdom is one against which the gates of Hades cannot withstand his assault, right? So if you take Hades as a metaphor, that death, well, Paul says we were dead in our trespasses and sins. So another metaphor, not only I'm blind, I'm dead, I can't see. I'm so helpless, I'm dead, I can't see. Then the gates that hold me in to Hades, the realm of the dead, cannot withstand the assault of Christ's kingdom. That's what he's saying. The gates of Hades will not prevail. In other words, they can't hold when I come to open them. They will give way. I will set you free. So, yes, our blindness is not our own willful blindness. Maybe once in a while, but largely it's not, which is why Jesus says, forgive them because they do not know what they're doing. He doesn't blame them for their ignorance. They're victims of their ignorance, right? And they need someone to heal them. Okay, last thought, going to be Derek.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad she spoke before me. I mean, it was so great. I think one other aspect of this that is, I think I've been thinking about a lot because trying to think about how to walk alongside people who are neurodivergent and thinking about some of these things, because their existence, their experiences are so different than mine. And the things that the words I use that make sense to me don't often compute or help. Whereas I still think that as capable and in some ways they experience God in aspects of them that I don't, I'm sure, right? So one, it's still, you're still stuck with the question, like everybody still has to decide what to lean into before. If it starts with an action, you have to pick an action.
Pick an action.
And how do we do that? It's interesting to me that Scripture has, Paul, Jesus, there's a lot of places where we're given advice on that. It's like sort of wisdom advice. It seems to me that it's the emphasis, the metaphor that's used the most, I think, is fruit and judging the fruit. And I think that's a universally human, like we can all appreciate goodness. We know it when we see it, but we experience it, and then it's not about. It's interesting that like the fruits of the Spirit are not in concordance with Scripture necessarily, or the figuring or knowing the right thing.
Yeah.
And so while knowledge, I think, is integral, and this is a really interesting like version of knowledge that you're bringing to us. I'm gonna have to think more about what this means, but I'd love to unpack. Anybody has advice on how to have these conversations with kids who have autism, But I think one thing that I'm trying to lean into myself, at least for now, is that concept. So it's God if it's love, if it's good, if it has good fruit, it came from something good. The tree must be good, right? So it may not matter that much how they arrived exactly at, the nutrients they needed for that fruit to come.
I like it. I like it. All right. Thank you for thoughts, and have a blessed week. Go in peace.